All right, Christina, thank you very much for a lovely intro. As Christina said, I run an agency helping people with podcasts, get started, all you need to know. And the workshop today, or the deck I've got really, is everything around how to start, why you want to do it, what kit you need to get started. And Veronica, for you and becoming a guest on our podcast, I've not got anything on this, but I can certainly send you some resources on becoming a guest, because that's actually a good way to grow your own podcast in general. So the agenda really, starting off with why you want to start a podcast, then what format you can choose, branding, how to record remotely, the best equipment, how you host it, which is actually getting it out onto the different podcast platforms, and then marketing and distribution, getting those listeners, which will be useful for you, Sarah. So I'm going to kick off with why podcasting. Why might you want to start a podcast? Well, starting off, it's a passive medium. It's something people do when they're on a run, when they're commuting. Well, not at the moment really. When people are doing exercise, it's not something you actively have to do, like with a video or with written content, with books. That's more active, which means that if you put on your podcast when you're at the gym, you're likely to listen to the whole thing, whereas you might add a blog to your watch later, or you might want to watch a video later, for instance. But podcasting is passive, and that's one of the huge benefits of it. You can go in depth into a topic to really show your subject matter expertise. And I think this is something that a lot of content marketers have a lot of information they can't quite put into that video or that blog post. If you've got a 30-minute to 40-minute podcast, you can really go in depth and explore that topic. And I think a lot of people like that, going more in depth into certain topics. You can speak to different industry experts. It's content-based networking. A lot of interview shows that I've helped produce, people end up speaking to some of the best people in their industry. And since I've started my Marketing Mashup podcast, I've managed to get some fantastic guests. Brian Halligan, CEO of HubSpot, is my favorite, Paul, and I like to tell everyone about it, because I managed to catch him when he was in London, and we recorded the episode in person. It was fantastic to meet him. And I think everyone else that is starting an interview podcast, you get to have these conversations with people. I have clients that start podcasts to speak to their customers and to generate a better relationship with them, and that works really well too. And then this is something that I find important, and it's a different metric you can start to think about, because podcasts can help build trust. How can they build trust? Think about time with brand. Now, this is something that Wistia talk about a lot, if you're familiar with Wistia, the video marketing tool. But the amount of time people spend with your brand in a podcast is significantly more than other types of content. So for instance, if you have a 30-minute weekly show, that's potentially 2 hours every month spent with your brand, where you can build a relationship with the listener, with your audience, compared to a short form video or social media content or a blog, which is considerably less time over that month. So time with brand is a really interesting metric that I've been using for my own podcast and building a relationship with my clients and my customers. And then this is quite a huge thing for me, because podcasts can fuel so much other content. Because you might be recording 30 minutes to an hour of content, if you're filming it, you can turn it into the video content that you can put on social media. You can turn the videos into blog posts or vice versa. Social media posts, LinkedIn carousels, Instagram carousels. There's so much you can do when you record these podcasts. Get the transcript done for them, because that'll also help you with SEO a ton. So it really can fuel a lot of content. And there's two podcasts, well, there's quite a few podcasts, but there's two in particular that do this really well. This is called the Stallman Podcast. It's by a YouTuber, and he puts a lot of production into the podcast. He films this completely remotely. I'll play it here without sound. I've not shared my sound at the moment, but you can see it's super high quality, and he's got a multicam setup where Renee here is in the other side of the country recording with a really nice setup, great audio, and then Tyler's doing the same, and he has the split screen setup, the different angles, and then he can break this down into so many different bits of content. And then you've got the Joe Rogan podcast. I mean, a lot of people know about this. Joe Rogan's a really strange one because he's been doing it for so long. He's managed to capture a lot of the early podcasting market, 1,500 episodes, Post Malone, a recent one here. But what Joe Rogan does superbly is he takes little clips from his podcast, which are recorded, and he uploads them to the Joe Rogan Experience Clips YouTube channel, and they get millions and millions and millions of views. If you can take what these guys do for your marketing podcast, for your company or for yourself, and break it down into different snippets you can share, different blogs that you can share, you're going to do great. Matt Devella is another guy who he's another YouTuber that does a podcast that he turns into these 10-minute narrative, really brilliant videos that get, again, millions of views. But you're not too worried about millions of views, but stuff that is entertaining and engaging for your audience. The final thing really about podcasting is it's really fun. Once you start getting into producing your podcast, you'll be surprised at how much you enjoy the process of recording it, meeting new people, having conversations if you're not doing an interview show with someone. The research of it, it's all really enjoyable. Next up, format. Now, there is no right format for your podcast, but the first thing you want to do now you know you want to start a podcast, is what format are you going to choose? I'll run through these as quickly as possible. First of all, you got the interview show. This is the most common. It's the easiest. It's the most versatile. You'll see the majority of podcasts in marketing are like this. My podcast is like this. A conversation, one person, another person. It can be quite difficult in terms of logistics and remote recording, but I've got a few tips on that later in the presentation. A news show, this can take a lot of research. It's not massively evergreen, but it is quite easy to produce once you get into a rhythm of it. In terms of marketing, I'm not too sure how many people do specifically news podcasts, but if you're in whatever sector you're in, you could do a podcast on News Air and people will go specifically to you for that information. Content and blog base, Seeking Wisdom by David Cancel and Dave Gerhardt, who's now moved on from Drift. This is a really interesting podcast, actually, if you haven't listened to it, because they take lots of different shows, they produce lots of different shows and put them under one podcast feed. So your podcast is, back to the basics, an RSS feed, and they have lots of different shows under this one feed, which is an interesting way of doing things. But if you've already written a ton of content, you're already producing content, take that and turn it into a podcast. So if you've written a blog, make that the topic of your podcast, co-host it with one of your co-workers and talk through in a little bit more in depth that particular topic. The benefits of this, you've already got the content and you can build a relationship with your audience if you co-host it with someone, if you have regular hosts to do this. A narrative podcast. Now, this one is a little bit more difficult for marketers, because you can either do a fictional one like Gimlet's Homecoming. Gimlet, if you don't know, are a podcast network. They produce super high quality podcasts, but they're owned podcasts by them. But the narrative ones, they're super entertaining. It's not very saturated because they take a lot of work to do. Probably a best example in marketing is How I Built This, the podcast. That's quite narrative driven, but it is still an interview show. So something to consider there. A solo podcast, there aren't very many of these, to be honest. The Naval podcast, which is short and sweet, sort of 2-3 minute episodes. You could do this with a blog. If you write a blog and you just want to read your blog and have a different medium to get people to or a different medium to reach people, a passive medium as opposed to them reading your blog, you can just create an audio version. This will build a really deep relationship. If you just got one person reading that blog and making that podcast, you will start to build that connection with your audience. But there's no one to bounce off, so it could be tricky. And I put here, you need to find the right personality. I would mention, I think this is true throughout all of the different types of podcasts. You need to have quite a bubbly, interesting personality. There's no point putting your CEO on the podcast if they're boring. If you have some young person in your company that's really interesting, really enthusiastic, really engaging, then pick them over your CEO, because at the end of the day, people are choosing to spend time to listen to your content. So what format should you choose out of those? What do we have? We have solo, narrative, content, blog-based, news shows, interview shows. It depends, really does depend. What would your audience listen to? One thing I haven't really covered here is how long should a podcast be? That depends as well. How much time do you have to produce it? How much content do you reckon you'll think you'll have? How much editing do you want to do? Do you have lots of content and you'd like to turn that into a podcast? Do you want to listen? Do you want to start speaking with industry experts or customers and clients? Then an interview show will work for you. But explore a few different options of formats to see what will work best for you. Branding. Strong branding helps you stand out. You've decided on the format. You now have to pick a brand for your podcast that is really strong. You know this because this is the same with your actual brand of your company. The podcast is kind of the same. This is what my Pocket Cast, which is why I use to listen to the podcast, this is what it looks like. This is a screenshot off my iPad. How many of these stand out to you, or how many of these get lost in the grid? Your branding needs to really stand out. You've got to choose something distinctive, bright, bold. A few other branding things apart from the design is having a good presence across social media channels. If you've already got a good presence on your Instagram, on your Twitter, on your LinkedIn from your company page, just use that for your podcast. If you really want to go at it, then you can create your own social channels for the podcast. This becomes useful when your podcast gets quite big. You get lots of listeners that people want to follow that type of content. And then audio branding. What do I mean by audio branding? That's sort of the music that will go throughout or theme tune that will go throughout your episodes. I try to get custom ones done for any of my clients, because that means that it just adds that little extra bit of personality and distinctiveness among the other podcasts. On to how to record. Now, we've come out of our format. We've got some really distinctive branding. We now have to get recording. Now, at the moment, everything is really being recorded remotely. Dom Kent, who is a member of Content UK, did a superb article on this on my blog that I'll make sure, well, Christina, if you can link that in the chat when you've got a moment, or in the Slack, because this article is really, really useful in terms of recording your podcast remotely. But some tips from the article: find a quiet place to record it. No one wants a noisy podcast. Use a booking tool to book your guests, or if you don't need that, if you've not got a guest. Make sure all of your hosts have good quality microphones. I'll get onto that a little bit later, but I now ship mics out to my guests. I've got this little Rode microphone which costs £100. It's a USB one. I send it out to all of my guests before I get them on my podcast, because that way I can guarantee the audio quality is really good. And you can double down on that audio quality by recording using a native platform, or a platform that records the audio locally. It's different to Zoom, because when you're recording on Zoom, which is sort of the default for most people, is it records over the internet, so you get the internet recording, as opposed to using something like Riverside.fm, CleanFeed, or Zencaster. Again, I'll send links after this to these platforms, but what it does is it records that audio to the person's laptop directly, or directly from their microphone, and then uploads that. So when you go to edit, you've got their raw recording rather than the Zoom recording, which isn't so great. Put in loads of prep. If you're recording remotely, you want to make sure your guests are good, or you've got enough content to make sure it goes smoothly. Send them notes beforehand, even do a tech call beforehand. Thank you, Christina, for sharing that link in the chat. And plan in some extra time for any tech issues you might have while we're recording remotely. There's things that can go wrong, so give yourself an extra 15 minutes for it. And then recording in general, invest in some good equipment. Now, we had a question about how important it is to invest in good gear. Now, I cover this in the next section. I think it does depend on how much budget you have for it, how good you want it to sound. It isn't as important as having good, engaging content, but I also think that it's cheap enough that you can get good gear and make your podcast sound really good. Have good mic technique. You'll notice if I move away from this, it doesn't sound nearly as good. So if you can get nice and close to your microphone when you're recording, it's going to sound fantastic. It's really the problem when you're recording on your laptop as well. Your laptop, if you think about it, is a foot or two away from you, whereas a microphone here is a couple of inches away from me. Sound treat the room if you can. Blankets, carpets, rugs. If you have a room which is not sound treated, it will sound echoey and horrible. The sound will bounce off the walls and it won't sound so good. A little tip here: a car is your own personal recording booth. The sound in the car is perfect because it's all dampened and fantastic. But that's a sort of, if you don't have a good space, last resort, you can record in your car. And finally, enjoy it. If you're not enjoying the recording, it will really come through in to your guests. You have to enjoy it. You have to not just do it for leads or for an amount of views. Do it because you enjoy it, and that will come through a lot better. So the equipment, I'll run through this quickly because there's no one size fits all approach to the right equipment. It depends on your situation, your budget, how you want it to sound. But going from recording on your laptop or your phone to spending £100 on a microphone is a world of difference. Excuse me. So you will need a microphone, first thing to buy. Here's a sort of matrix of different options. There are a ton of different mic options. These are just ones that I've used and I really like. A cheap USB one, the Rode NT USB Mini. There's a typo in that. It's the Rode NT USB Mini, which is this one. It's fantastic. It plugs in via USB. It sounds pretty good. I've been recommending it to everyone over the last few months of recording remotely. £100, plug straight into your laptop. Sounds good. But remember the mic etiquette. Get it as close to your mouth as possible. If you can get a mic stand, if you want to take a note, this is the Rode PSA1 arm, but you can get a newer one off Amazon for £20 and they work just as well. So a USB mic will plug directly into your laptop. An XLR microphone, the next three are XLR microphones. You get a slightly better signal and more control over your audio if you use an XLR connection, but you will need an audio interface, which is the next slide. But a cheap one, the Shure SM58, which is a little, I have one, it's up there.
Looks like James has frozen. He did warn that his internet gets a bit dodgy sometimes and it might cut out for 2-3 minutes. So I think that is what has happened. But you all enjoying it so far? I'm hoping they'll come back.
Yeah, it's really useful. How's everybody else feeling?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really useful for me too.
Yeah,
Cool.
really, really good. Yeah.
Good stuff. Yeah, I'm really tempted to do a Content UK podcast now.
Yay.
Yeah.
I use the Shure mic, actually, the cheap one.
Oh, had a few disappearances. Hello.
Hello.
Let me.
Hey.
I'm gonna ping James a message. Yeah, he said, give me a few minutes, it should come back. Ah, there he is. Okay.
Sorry, I said to Christina before, I said my connection drops out at the most inopportune times, and it did exactly that then. So let me get my screen back up for you guys. Where'd I drop out, Christina?
I think you were talking about the USB, the first microphone, the £100 one.
Oh, really? Oh, I was
Let's-
talking for ages after that.
No,
Okay.
Talking about the Shure SM7B, and you were saying it is better because.
Okay. All right.
Veronica's paying best retention.
Right. So I'll just quickly run over it again. This slide's pretty self-explanatory. USB cheap, £100 Rode NT USB Mini, an XLR cheap, the SM58. You can get an SM50. You can get the Rode on it. It'll be fine, to be honest. The SM58, if you want an XLR cheap microphone, but it sounds very good. Rode Procast, the one I'm using now, it's fantastic. About £180. The reason I use it is to be honest, I just think it looks better. I've done a comparison of the two microphones. I'll get a link for that after. It's law of diminishing returns at this point after about £200. The Shure SM7B, that's the one you see in the Joe Rogan podcast. A lot of the well-known podcasters will use it. It's about 350 quid a microphone. Then for the XLR microphones, feel free to take a screenshot of this. For recording straight into your computer, it's called a Focusrite 2i2. XLR straight into your laptop. External recording, that's onto an SD card. You can also plug it into your laptop too. Zoom H6, that's got 4 inputs, so you can put up to four mics into it. Then for a full production setup, look at the Rode Rodecaster. I've used it before, but I don't own one at the moment. I love it. It's fantastic. All right, so that's the gear. Hosting. Okay, now hosting is getting your podcast onto Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. Anchor is a free version that a lot of people use. You don't technically own your podcast with Anchor, which is why I usually don't recommend it to people. Anchor technically owns your podcast. So if, say, you want to move away, you have to contact Anchor to get their email to be able to move to somewhere else. It got acquired by Spotify a couple of years ago or last year. Make of that what you will. The thing is, I find with free things, if they have no pay plan, I wonder what they're doing with my data. So I wouldn't always recommend Anchor to people. If you don't have any budget, then use it, fine. It is a good product and it works well. If you want a paid host, I recommend Transistor. I use this for all of my podcasts and all of my client podcasts. There are a few alternatives such as Captivate, Simplecast, Bcast. There's actually a ton of different podcast hosts. I use Transistor because you can have as many podcasts as you want under a certain amount of downloads, and their entry plan is about $19 a month. A lot of the others are similarly priced. The entry level is between $15 and $20 a month. For that, you will own your podcast. You get better support and more podcaster-focused features. They're making a platform that you pay for that has features specifically designed for podcasters, whether that be a podcast website, a really nice embeddable player, growth features. I know Captivate do specifically talk about growth a lot. So there are many options. I would recommend Transistor because it's what I use personally and it works really well. You record your podcast, you upload it to the host, and then it will distribute it out to the different podcast players. Marketing and distribution. Now, there's a lot of ways.
Oh no, he's gone again. All doing okay? Just going to do some awkward chat now.
Okay. An icebreaker.
Icebreaker question. What are your favourite podcasts? What do you listen to?
Who wants to go first?
You?
Yeah, sure. You know what? I haven't been into the into podcast game. I've just entered it, and I'm really enjoying the Minimalists podcast. I think it's just so interesting for adults who want to pursue a better life. And it's just, yeah, it's an amazing podcast. What about you?
Yeah, big fan of the Minimalists one as well. It's really good. Also the guy that James mentioned earlier, Matt Diavella, he did the Netflix documentary for the Minimalists.
Oh, I'm meaning to see that.
Yeah, it's really good. It's the same guys who do the podcast. They've blown up now, but so the guy who did that documentary for them, Matt Diavella, he's got this one called The Ground Up Show, which is very much the similar sort of thing. He's a minimalist as well, so I think you'll like that one too.
Nice. Thanks for the suggestion. I'll check it out.
Sure.
Is the Minimalist not by Matt Diavella, but just a similar topic?
Yeah, the Minimalists are these two guys. I think they're called like Ryan and Sean or something like that. And yeah, they're different to Matt. Matt has got his own one called The Ground Up Show.
Ah, you know Matt Diavella.
Yeah.
He's a beast with his podcast. All right, well, where did I get up to, guys? Sorry.
What were you saying? Can you flick your slides back on? That might help refresh.
You just started the marketing slide, yeah.
Okay.
Slide.
So this is what a lot of you will be interested in. It's how do you market your podcast? How do you get it out to people once you've created it? It is a known channel, so there's no algorithms to compete with, but there's no algorithms to help you get new listeners. It is most similar to. Hold on, am I showing my screen still? Yeah.
No.
Oh. There you go.
Yeah.
Was I sharing my screen for the entirety of the last section?
Yeah, you were.
Okay, good. Yeah, so podcasts, they're a known channel. It's most similar to an email newsletter in terms of you have to go out and get listeners. But I've got 15 ways to do it here. Take a screenshot of this. There's also an article if Christina can share it in the chat. But guesting on other podcasts is a superb way of getting people listening to yours, because word of mouth is a great way to share it. Getting a transcript for SEO benefits. Use a tool such as Veed to create a promotional video. Obviously, post it on your social channels. Find guests if you're doing a guest show with good audiences, and just ask them to share. That can help. Share links to all the platforms. Write a blog post with your key learnings from the podcast. Reddit post in communities. If you're just creating your podcast from scratch, if it's your own one, you can create an email list. But what I would say for you guys, content marketers, send the podcast out to your email list. I think we get a lot of our for one of my clients, we have a huge email list which we get a lot of our listeners to. And if you're have an email list notifications for your podcast, so every time you release a podcast, it goes out to them. film it. I've talked about the benefits of filming your podcast. Run some ads. Turn your key learnings into a LinkedIn or an Instagram slideshow. Podcast aggregators. These are sort of scrapers, podcast scrapers. There's a list of them in the blog post. You can post on something called Pod Hunt as well. So there's 15 different ways to promote your podcast, but you have to think about it like an email newsletter in terms of sharing it and generating subscribers that way. But that's a whistle stop tour of how you start a podcast. I think I've covered everything.
And then disappeared right at the pivotal moment. Let me just quickly tell him that he's gone missing again. You've gone again. Okay, we'll just pick up our conversation from before. Any other good podcasts that you've been listening to? I really like The High Low. It's just like these two friends, and they just talk about current affairs, books that are out at the moment, shows, and they're just two people talking about programs. I haven't described that well, but it's really good.
I like what would Dolly do? It's quite funny.
What would
Dolly Parton? Yeah.
You've got a separate podcast.
Oh, I've lost you as well.
So she's on The High Low as well. Is that a separate podcast that she does?
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, it's quite funny.
Yeah, she's very funny.
I'm losing you a bit though.
I need to invest in a microphone.
Yeah. Cool.
There's a really good one called Reasons to Be Cheerful. I don't know if anyone's heard of it. And we're back.
Guys, this is bad. 3.5 an hour, I think, is my record of internet dropouts.
Wow.
Oh gosh.
Does this happen when you're doing your podcast?
Yes, it's horrible. It's the worst thing. And that's actually why I stopped using Zoom, because it would cut out the recording. But using something like Riverside or CleanFeed, because it comes locally from the other person's laptop, the recording doesn't get missed out. They can carry on speaking and it will be fine. This is purely because I've moved home out to the country, out of my London nice reliable connection. But yeah, I can only apologise, guys.
We were entertaining ourselves.
Yeah.
As James mentioned, this is now the question section, so feel free to turn your cameras on and put some difficult questions to James.
Yes. I'll while you're thinking of some questions, I'll answer some of the ones that came before from Gemma and a few others. One thing I didn't cover, and Gemma's asked what are the best tools to use for your podcast. In terms of recording, if you're recording straight into your laptop, use Audacity to record, or if you're doing it remotely, the platforms will record that automatically for you. For editing, I use there's a few different ones to use. I actually use Final Cut Pro because I do video ones, but if you can use Audition, which is by Adobe. If you've got the Adobe suite, you can actually edit in Audacity if you wanted to. And then there's GarageBand you can use if you're on a Mac. So various different tools to edit, and then Veed if you want to make the videos afterwards. And then how necessary is it to invest in good audio equipment? I would, as I said in the presentation, spending £100 on a microphone should be the minimum, really. But it is more about the content that you produce. It's about making something that's engaging for your audience instead of the gear you use. You can spend thousands of pounds on audio gear to get it sounding really good, but you can get it sounding fantastic by just buying one of these one of these little USB microphones.
And then that's great. And then for the preparation, how long do you take to prepare content, or even to prepare an interview? Is it?
Yeah, great question. For interviews, I'll show you exactly how I prep them, because I don't do too much. I probably do about half an hour preparation for a guest, coming up with questions. A lot of the guests I have on podcasts and on clients' podcasts, I'll know them already. So can you see the uncensored CMO here? Yeah. So we go through and plan out all the episodes like this. My Marketing Mashup one, very similarly, I will write all of my questions in here. I'll do an intro, which is the intro to them, which I'll read out on the podcast, all of my different questions. And then while I'm editing, I'll also add to this. And I'll send this to my guests beforehand so that they can have a read of the questions, so they're well prepared. I always ask my guests to come up with some questions and some answers for me. The best person I ever had literally printed out 3 pages of responses that he'd written down from my questions. And throughout the episodes, he was referencing his notes. He wasn't reading from them. He was just looking down. He was able to come up with some fantastic examples from it.
You cut out for like a couple of seconds.
Oh my word, I'm sorry.
All right, you came back quickly this time.
Okay. I will summarize, send notes to your guests, questions, and get them to prepare some for you or some responses to the questions, and it will help when you go to do the recording. Make sure they look at them though, because if they don't look at it, they come unprepared and you'll have to guide them through it. Just make sure they read the notes beforehand.
Yeah, because I remember they did a podcast to me once and they didn't ask me anything. So everything was totally unprepared, but then they did a lot of editing. So I don't know what would be the best.
Yeah, well, it's a good question about editing as well. And another question we have is, how long should a podcast be? Yeah. It entirely depends. If you have both, if you prepare as your guest as best as possible and then record for an hour and say the episode is only going to be 30 minutes and you cut out all the bits you don't want, the worst thing is if you have a podcast that's unprepared and you're relying on the editing to make it sound good, is not the best way to go about it.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Cool.
Hey,
any other?
I've got a question. Hi. Yeah. Do you have to know about SEO when you're kind of? I know that you can add it when you're putting your pod up.
What do you use to host yours, Sarah? Buzzsprout. Okay. I've not used Buzzsprout, but there's a thing in podcasting called ID3 tagging. Have you heard of that? Which is the keywords you can use for your podcast, which helps in terms of searchability. Some podcast hosts let you upload transcripts, which again is great for searching. The other thing I'd recommend is having really thorough show notes, having lots of references, having timestamps of what you've covered throughout the episode. I don't know how in depth you go into your show notes, but having really thorough ones will help with podcast SEO. And then taking it off of just the podcast players and uploading your transcript to your website or your blog.
Oh, really?
Will help with that as well. Yeah. So you can upload the full transcript to your podcast page, or you could do a summary blog which contains the embedded player for your podcast. That won't help with searchability in the podcast players, but what that will do is help your podcast grow just through Google search and through just generally people reading your blog.
Oh, lovely. Thank you. Cool.
we did have a question which I said I promised I'd ask about how you generate leads from your podcast, or how you can turn a podcast listener into a customer. And I find that quite interesting, because podcasting is very much top of the funnel awareness type content, and it is hard to take them straight to a customer. But if you think about the trust you're building, and going back to the time with brand thing I was mentioning earlier, the amount of trust you can build with someone will help you considerably further along in your marketing funnel. If they've listened to your, say if you have your CMO talking on your podcast, and they then go to have a conversation with the CMO about the product because they're now ready to convert that stage in the buying cycle, they already feel like they have the relationship with that person, and that will help you massively. But the analogy I use with a podcast listening to a customer is first date into marriage. Your podcast is your first date, and every episode they listen to is another date. And when you get married, then they're a customer.
Great stuff. Well, I've got a question. So if you have multiple guests, do you introduce them to each other beforehand, or what's? Yeah,
that's an interesting one. Are they so it would just be multiple guests from the external to your company? Yeah, they're all external. Yeah, so the FinTech Insider do this really well. They have multiple guests from multiple different companies, but it'll be good to do a quick sort of briefing call, 15 minutes, get everyone together, just so they can, it's easy when you're doing a one-on-one podcast to just tell someone, don't stray from the mic, here's how it's going to go. If you can brief all of them and do a little introduction, check the chemistry's all okay, there's no tension between people too much, but just get them all together before, make sure they're introduced. Otherwise it might be a little bit cagey to start off with, and people are not too sure when they can talk. But if they all know each other, then that would be helpful.
Cool.
Cool. Any more questions, guys?
One question I had is, when you're working for a company, you want to like start a podcast, they might say there are so many podcasts now, like what you're going to get drowned out from all the other podcasts. What argument would you give against that?
Yes, so I love answering this, because podcasts are not oversaturated at the moment. The market is still super young, really. There's about 1 million podcasts out there versus YouTube channel is around 30 million. Yet a lot of marketers won't think twice about starting a YouTube channel because they know the audience is there. You do have the algorithm granted to push you, but there's far more competition. A lot of the 1 million podcasts out there as well, a lot of them I don't have the actual stats, but a lot of them won't go past 4 or 5 episodes. Something like 80% of podcasts hosted on Anchor haven't gone past 5 episodes. So actual good quality, consistent podcasts, there is still a huge market for them. And if you've got a specific niche that might be underserved in terms of podcasts, then you can serve them. And because it's a passive medium, there's more opportunity for people to listen to them, rather than if you start a YouTube channel. That's another thing people have to actively do. If you can work your way into people's passive schedule, so they're 30 minutes when they're cooking, running, commuting, whatever, then you're gonna really reap the benefits of it.
Thanks. There are lots of opportunities for podcasting. It's good.
Yeah. So there's a few people that have left. There's a few people still here. This is an offer for everyone. I'll put this in the Slack as well. I help people launch and edit podcasts, 20% off with the code Content UK. we can do the entire thing for you if you want, in terms of launching your podcast, or if you just want a little bit of editing help. Plan to start nice and cheap as well. If you want to just have a little dabble into it, we can just help you get it set up for a couple of episodes and send you on your way for the editing.
Thanks, James, for offering that to everyone. That's really nice of you.
Cool.
And thank you so much. That was really interesting and useful. So much good stuff from there.
Cool. Well, I look forward to seeing the podcast people start, and how those have already started to grow their podcasts. If you've got any questions, any further questions, if you want to have a bit more of a conversation with me about it, I'll be in the Slack for any questions.
Awesome.
Thanks, James.
Thank you, James. Really helpful.
Right.
Can we get the slides afterwards?
Yeah, sure. I'll send these around.
Thanks. Cheers. Really, really enjoyed it. Thanks.
Thank you, mate.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.